We've heard it for decades now that our next big wars will be fought over water. So far, though, we haven't really seen that happen. Why is that? Are our predictions wrong? Do we need to rethink the role of water in transboundary relationships? This is SIWI Corner at World Water Week 2023. My name is Andreas Karlsson, and with me on stage today I have Martina Klimes and Anton Earl, both from Stockholm International Water Institute, and Yelisaveta Demidenko, Global Water Partnership, and also Junior Rapporteur at this year's World Water Week. Martina, if I can start with you. So let's go straight for the big question I introduced there. When will we see big wars over water?
Thank you, Andreas. This is a very popular question, and I know that many journalists ask this question. And this is the only thing they would like to talk about. But I think we will not see interstate conflicts over water. Why not? Because countries have so many other sectors where they cooperate, and we also have different systems of check and balances. So it is very unlikely. I would say the probability is extremely low that two nation states would engage in a conflict, armed conflict, over water resources. On the other side, we do see that states tend to cooperate. However, what we will see that fragile and conflict-affected areas and countries and regions, when they face water scarcity, that really exacerbates the situation. It really fuels the conflicts that are already happening. So what we will see is that in certain regions that face ongoing conflicts, and that will also see water shortages, the situation will worsen, and it can contribute to escalating of the existing conflicts.
Anton, you're based at SIWI's office in Pretoria, in South Africa, and on a continent which is really no stranger to droughts. Can you put this into an Africa perspective, perhaps? Do we see any tendencies towards conflicts over water?
Well, that's the thing. On the African continent, it's sometimes referred to as the most transboundary continent, in that almost every country in Africa, on the mainland in Africa, shares a water body with another country. And when you look at the data, much like what Martina has pointed out, there's much more evidence to show that countries collaborate and cooperate over their shared water courses, and that the possibility of conflict directly between countries over shared waters is actually low. However, having said that, we might not be seeing conflicts coming out, but we are seeing what you might refer to as suboptimal outcomes. Suboptimal in the sense that ecosystems are being degraded, local communities aren't getting the benefit of developing water resources and receiving water. And in the long run, some of the benefits of economic development and economic integration aren't happening. So that's why it's becoming really important to make sure that we shift our focus from one of saying, let's try and prevent conflicts, to say, well, what can we do to try and encourage and push forward cooperation and set in place the various institutions and joint mechanisms you need between countries to unlock the benefits of these water bodies?
And we'll get to that. First, I would just like to ask you as well. Elisa, how would you describe the relationship between water and the risk of conflicts? Is there such a link?
That's a very interesting question, because essentially we who need water have conflicting interests. So conflicts over water is a conflict of interest. We don't trust each other, and then we are afraid that this resource is going to be taken from us. So here you have it. So basically, human dynamics and human errors, they fuel this energy that then goes into the risk of conflicts. But something else that I wanted to bring up, we've heard about the importance of the Transboundary River Basin organizations and mitigating these conflicts. But something that is becoming more and more evident is that these organizations that manage rivers need to work with those that manage the seas. We're seeing also increasing tensions over international waters, and this is something where a lot more countries have interest than those that share the coast directly. And I believe that here we also have the unique role to turn back to the local level and see what role foreign ministries and kind of soft powers can play in informing the local actors and building this trust and fostering these collaborative relations between them. So really the link between water and conflict is in interpersonal relationships and how well can we trust each other.
Okay, I hear you. We'll flip the argument over. Martina, what is the relationship between water and peace?
Water is key to everything, and we would say that water, sufficient amounts of water and good governance foster stability and prosperity. So, of course, that we do see many linkages, but I think that I would again turn it the other way. How can water instability lead to insecure peace or cold peace, how we call it? So I think that what we see increasingly in many, and I think it's important which regions you talk about, because it's very difficult to generalize this. You will not have the same experience from Southern Africa and from other parts of the world as you, for example, have in the Middle East, or some parts of Central Asia, some parts of South Asia. So I think it's extremely important to contextualize it. That's why I like these general statements about the relationships between these two terms. Some can be quite misleading. So we really need to zoom in into the local level and really see how when communities become unstable, and that means that water we see is the key to everything. It's key to livelihoods, it's key to health, it's key to education, it's key to also, it's very important, it has very important gender aspects. And then if we don't have that, the communities become unstable. They really face a lot of challenges, and that can lead to tensions, that can lead to armed violence, that can lead to protests, that can lead to conflicts. So we really have to be aware of these linkages, and through this, I think it's very important that we reach out of our water bubble, and we really talk to the other sectors, because the sectors who work with issues like conflict prevention, peace building, crisis mitigation, they don't necessarily have the water background, and I think it's so important that our sector reaches out to them and that we really collaborate, we share experience, we share knowledge, and we work on this together.
And when you say our sector?
That I mean the water community. I would like to see here at the World Water Week more representatives of non-water sectors, and that doesn't go only to the peace sector, but I think also many other sectors that necessarily do not work with water.
Should we perhaps say something here? We talk about Transboundary and Transboundary Water Cooperation. What do we mean with Transboundary? You used the phrase yourself, Anton, so maybe you want to start.
Transboundary, of course, is any border that a river would cross, or an aquifer for that matter, if we're talking about groundwater. It doesn't necessarily have to be an international boundary. I mean, we see a lot of the cases of disagreements, to put it that way, over water sharing that might happen in a federal state between different subnational entities. Boundaries could also be between sectors, like Martina was saying. The kind of dialogues and the competition between sectors like agriculture, like energy, for instance, forms an effective boundary. And some sectors might be more powerful than other sectors and better at commandeering water resources. So this agenda of promoting cooperation around shared waters is really one that cuts across boundaries at different levels of scale.
Elisaveta, what is in your view the strongest argument for cooperation across borders about water?
I think one of the interesting cases that we've just discussed, we had a rich discussion in international water law, and one of the issues that came up was this cross-sectionality. And I think it's best depicted by the investment law and investment treaties. So countries basically agree with each other that we will treat each other's investors on equal terms. And what we're seeing over the past 5 years is almost each of these interstate treaties, they have now a provision on environmental considerations. So while we hear all of these calls for more water investments, for more work with the private sector, they're also getting a clear message that there will be policy change, there will be additional costs to making an investment, and I think this is something we would need to look into quite soon as well. How do we translate the value of investment from the private sector to the cost of investment to the government, and how far can we go with a policy change without it resulting in a risk of a conflict over water?
And how do we do that?
I think, again, coming back, I think trusting each other and sitting down at a table and having those safe spaces. I think essentially the UN Water Conference and the venues like that, this is the neutral space where a lot of negotiations can happen, or at least to start. And this is where you meet in a space that has the enabling environment to start the discussion.
Anton, coming back to you, you're currently working together with colleagues on a report about transboundary water cooperation and an outlook report on that. Can you describe the aim of the report?
Yes, so we as a policy institute, SIWI realizes it's got a mandate to find international lessons, international good practice on any topic related to water governance. So we saw this whole issue around water cooperation as being understudied, under-researched, in that we don't really have a thorough understanding of what leads to cooperative outcomes. So the report that we started working on under the International Center for Water Cooperation seeks to better understand the factors that lead to cooperation. So cooperation itself is difficult to study for two reasons. The first one is that generally we see the outputs of a cooperative process. So these outputs might be a shared agreement on sharing the waters of a river or a water body, or it might be an agreement to form a joint institution. But you don't see very much about the negotiation process that led up to that output. And typically states don't talk about that very much. These are sensitive kind of negotiations that go on typically behind closed doors, making them difficult to research. The second thing is that it's difficult to draw lessons and conclusions from different cases because each one is so different from other ones. You've got such a wide variety of geographical factors, economic factors, climatic factors, that it proves difficult to say, well, a certain approach to cooperation worked in a certain situation, would it work in another situation? So the study sets about to first develop a methodology that we applied to understanding cooperation. And that methodology really looks at the factors of cooperation. First and foremost, governance and leadership, which includes important issues such as the legal regime, stakeholder participation, gender issues. The second factor we looked at was data and information sharing. The third one about joint programs and activities, and the fourth one around finance. And the advantage of looking at these factors is that you find that there's a paper trail associated with them. Generally, if you are looking at countries choosing to pursue any of these activities, they have to agree on budgets, they have to have minutes of meetings that are typically easier to get your hands onto. So that's the approach we took to analyzing 32 river basins and ground basins across Africa.
And before we hear you say something about your findings, Martina, in your view, what characterizes successful cooperation over water?
That's a great question. I think this, we also need to contextualize it. So for example, in some transboundary basins, success can be considered a treaty because the cooperation there is advanced. There are not any geopolitical constraints. And then, so it's quite fairly easy to get to this point. However, in very complex transboundary basins like the Euphrates and Tigris, the Nile Basin, the Amu Darya, the Jordan River Basin, it's very difficult to set the final goal, the treaty, to measure the success by having a basin treaty agreement, because this will take decades. So there's successful thing, for example, what is now happening in the Euphrates and Tigris Basin, we have collaboration between Iraq and Turkey on technical level. And this is this type of meetings do not make the news because it's not very exciting to report that the technical committees have met. You know, as a journalist, you probably know this would not make headlines, but the collaboration is happening. And so it's so relative to measure success because in that context, this is a huge success because the two countries are communicating, they are exchanging experience, they are willing to meet, they are meeting on regular basis. And that is very important. So I think it's very difficult to generalize it, and we really need to look at it in a specific context. And I would like to add that we at SIWI, we actually work with these informal diplomacy processes. And it's very rewarding, it's very exciting to be able to bring these different actors together. And here I would like to point out that in these processes, the process really matters. You need to know who are the right people who should be in the room. You need to know how to get them. And you also need to know how to connect these technical levels to the levels that make political decisions. And that's always very difficult. You need to know who are really the people, the key people who make the political decisions in these countries. And often it's not that straightforward. It may not be the politicians, it may not be the ministers who are responsible for these departments, but it can be different groups. So you such as the different political groups, different interest groups, in some contexts even different religious leaders. So you really need sort of these skills that would normally sit with political science, with international relations, and that you need to bring it to the water context. And it's very important that you work together with the water professionals who then understand the technical aspect. So this is something what we call water diplomacy, where we work together across the different sectors.
Elisaveta, in your opinion, what constitutes successful water cooperation?
So I would go back to a recent study that we've done. So it was a study about various approaches to regional dialogues, how GLP understands them. And so we looked at 3 case studies where we have facilitated regional dialogue over the past 10 years. That was Southeast Europe, that was South Africa, and South Asia. So, and we looked at the factors that helped to advance cooperation to the next stage. So let's say the riparians started meeting around the table to share the data. How did they get to the part where they were managing the resource jointly when they were planning the investments, etc.? And we found that one of the key factors there was the role of facilitator. So again, the role of a personality is the role of a person that takes all of the interest that you have around the table and plans the agenda in a manner that there is various stages at which these key actors are engaged. And so let's say that you would start a discussion about water and then slowly move to other sectors, and then you will be getting more and more political will to continue this discussion, because suddenly there is a vested interest in the process. And so all of these parties are now interested in success, and they understand that mutual success will bring them more benefits. So this kind of very careful kind of crafting of the process, I think, is one of the reasons for the success for the transboundary cooperation.
And Anton, how does this fit in with what you find when you look at primarily Africa in the first iteration of the report?
Well, that's really interesting to hear the findings from your report. It echoes so much with what we found. I mean, looking at these 32 cases that we investigated, we looked at what the challenges were to promoting these factors of cooperation. And there's challenges across all of them. Some are linked to a lack of trust, others to a lack of resources, lack of a common vision. That I found really interesting that you mentioned that point, Lisa, because that came down in quite a few of the cases. But then more interestingly, we looked at innovations in these 32 cases to see locally what had been done to overcome these challenges. And that is truly inspirational, because of these 32 cases, we came up with over 60 innovative practices, showing how countries had actually managed to get over some of these challenges that they posed. So for instance, one of the cases was around the Lake Chad Basin Commission. And for a long time, they were, about 40 years ago, negotiating the treaty to form the commission. And they found that it proved very difficult to get all of the countries that, whose water bodies flowed into Lake Chad to agree on a commission, on an agreement right from the start. So what they did was to start incrementally, work incrementally, by starting with the littoral states only, so the ones that really are bordering on the lake. They formed an agreement. And over time, it took about 20 years of them working together. Other countries that were further upstream came on board. Until now, today, all the countries sharing that basin are part of that agreement. So it's a pragmatic approach that emerges, that countries actually work out, let's start off cooperating, even if it is at a smaller scale, and you can build on that. So you build these foundations, and slowly over time, that evolves into more solid foundations and more solid cooperation.
I imagine that there are so many challenges in this also, and to get to this sort of successful cooperation. Martina, what are the main challenges that you see?
I see, since I work mainly in the really conflict-affected regions, big challenge is really to bring in other stakeholders and to really get, for example, consultation with the local groups, because for different reasons, that's always not happening in the same manner as it's happening in other transboundary basins. And I think that is also important to get really hear the voices of people who are actually affected by the lack of water, because they are the ones who live in the areas that are really facing severe water scarcity. They are the ones, some of them, they don't even have drinking water. And to be able to channel these voices from the ground, to be reflected in these high-level negotiations, that is difficult. And of course, for many different reasons. The other reason is there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation, because we are looking in a big uncertainty. Many countries do not know how the landscape will look, how much water they will need, how much water they will have, and to communicate to the public about these challenges from the government is very difficult. Often what we see is a blame game. It's it's easier to blame others than to really recognize we really have to do a lot of work on our part. We need to improve the way how we manage water internally. And to admit this, that's difficult, and that creates this space for the different misinformation and disinformation campaigns. And I do see that with the increase of new technologies, including artificial intelligence, this can become a bigger problem. So new technologies do bring us more solutions. We can have better access to data, but at the same time, that can also create more inequality, because not everyone will have the same access to data based on their human resources and other capacity. And it can really be a big challenge. So I think what we need from the international sector, we do need to think about the ethics, the ethical code, and the standardization behind this. So that is a big part for all of us to play.
Elisabetta, what challenges do you see?
I think I would see primarily two challenges related to transboundary cooperation. First being agreements that have existed for a long time, for example, basin agreements not being updated to keep up with the minimum standards being raised, for example, as to how the water resources are protected. One good example is the Okavango River Commission that has updated its agreements to include the principle of no significant harm after the SADC protocol on shared water courses has been signed. So basically they had a shared vision and they were agreeing that, you know, the minimum standard has to be raised, but this example should really be followed in many more transboundary basins. And the second significant risk that I would say is there as well is the threat to transboundary infrastructure that already exists. For example, looking at the agreement that exists between Moldova, Ukraine on the Dniester River Basin, the agreement has pushed forward the transboundary cooperation between two countries significantly and specifically resolved the claims as to the hydropower dam construction that was looming in the future. But we've also seen significant and damaging hits and attacks on the transboundary infrastructure in that basin in the course of the war in Ukraine. And then we pose ourselves the question, how do we conflict-proof the transboundary infrastructure? How can we plan for it, not only on the technical level, but how we can we ensure that we have the necessary support to then address this issue?
And how can we do that?
Well, first of all, I think that the transboundary river basin organizations that are in the same region, they often are interdependent on one another. First, because of course, transboundary aquifers that often go beyond the transboundary rivers, but also since they pose such a great power in terms of the geopolitical negotiations. So if they are able to exchange this information, if they're able to plan for this contingency, I would say, then I feel like we will see a breakthrough in that regard.
Anton, you said earlier that it's really very much dependent on the context. How many sort of universal solutions do you think we can extract from this, or is it always very, very context specific?
That's the thing. I wouldn't go as far to say that any of the innovations we identified could be called universal solutions. Every case is still unique. That is true. But I think by seeing how challenges were overcome by actors in a certain setting, it gives a certain sense of inspiration around what can be done. It gives some sort of a sense of guidance as well, what sort of steps can be taken. So there's always going to be a role for well-intentioned outside organizations, such as policy institutes such as development partners, to be supporting cooperation processes. And the support can be in multiple forms. It can be supporting some of the technical studies that are needed for data to go into cooperation processes, or it could be in the form of capacity building. We saw several examples where different countries negotiating around a shared river have different levels of technical and financial capacity. So leveling that disparity can also make a big impact. So it could also be around convening, using their convening powers, sort of having a neutral platform, that a lot can be done in that sense.
Martina, how do we overcome the challenges that some of you have?
I think Elisabetta and Anton did summarize it very well. For me, it's still, I will continue repeating it, it's bringing in also other actors outside of the water. For me, it's crucial. I would like to see my colleagues from different dialogue facilitation organizations to work more with us, to help us also transfer skills. We do different workshops on experience sharing, when we, for example, bring negotiation teams from basins where they already reach some level of working mechanism, how they cooperate around water, not necessarily a treaty, but some mechanism, and we bring them to a context where this challenge has not yet been overcome, and to really help them think about these possible solutions. So I think we do need to bring in other actors, and we also need to think more about inclusivity. And when I say inclusivity, it of course doesn't mean only to think about the gender aspect, the youth aspect. For me, it's to really think which of the groups in certain basins are affected, and are we getting them involved? Do we have them? And which groups also make decisions on these issues, and are they at the table? Because often this is still not happening.
I'll give you a minute each for my last question, which is if you could send one message to political leaders around the world what they should do in this context, what would that be? Anton.
I'm reminded by a quote that was used by probably one of the earliest theorizers around water cooperation, Professor Tony Allen of King's College, who's passed away now and is a former Stockholm Water Prize laureate. And Tony was very fond of saying that the technically optimal will take second place to the politically probable. And you have to recognize that. So you have to work incrementally. You have to work with patience in mind and have a long-term trajectory. And I mean, that advice goes both for the countries that are embarking on cooperative processes around international waters, but also for the organizations that aim to support them. So there have been initiatives that I've seen that have just been done for a few years, and then they lose momentum. They run out of steam. So you really have to be in this for the long haul and make sure that you recognize, don't go for the technically optimal solution right from the start, but make sure you work with what is politically probable.
Elisabetta?
I would still bring it to the local level. My message would be that if you want the solution to last, you have to look at those who will be implementing it, who will be bearing the direct impact of your decision. And unless you have their buy-in, and unless you feel that they feel that they're included in the process, this decision unfortunately will not survive. We've heard many times that international agreements are complex, but having an agreement means nothing unless you're putting something into it. And that depends on the political will of those who sign it, and who is better to prompt them to do that than those local communities.
And Martina?
Yeah, I would follow up on that. In the peace world, we say agreement is 10% the agreement and 90% is implementation. So the implementation part is extremely important, and the message to the leaders would be, do pay attention to water, even in the regions when you think that there are so many other geopolitical issues, because when you will feel that now it's the time to solve the water issue, it will be too late. And in many of the very complex basins, we already have technical solutions. What we are lacking is the political support. So please do think about that, because if we cooperate, we all gain. The cost of non-cooperation is always higher than cost of cooperation.
Thank you all for joining me. This is SIWI Corner at World Water Week 2023. And I should say that if you are interested in these issues, you may want to check out the closing ceremony happening later today. Thank you all.
Well done.